The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant. Part 1. Continued. Cassette 1, Side 2. Apathy and passive resistance defeated Pius, while the abortive crusade that he undertook against the Turks absorbed his energy and his funds. Toward the end of his pontificate, he addressed a final appeal to the cardinals. People say that we live for pleasure, accumulate wealth, bear ourselves arrogantly, ride on fat mules and handsome palfreys, keep hounds for the chase, spend much on actors and parasites, and nothing in defense of the faith. And there is some truth in their words. Many among the cardinals and other officials of our court do lead this kind of life. If the truth be confessed, the luxury and pomp of our court is too great. And this is why we are so detested by the people that they will not listen to us, even when we say what is just and reasonable. What do you think is to be done in such a shameful state of things? We must inquire by what means our predecessors won authority and consideration for the Church. We must maintain that authority by the same means. Temperance, chastity, innocence, zeal for the faith, contempt of earth, the desire for martyrdom exalted the Roman Church and made her the mistress of the world. Despite the labors of popes like Nicholas V and Pius II, and of sincere and accomplished ecclesiastics like Cardinals Giuliano Cesarini and Nicholas of Cusa, the faults of the papal court mounted as the 15th century neared its end. Paul II wore a papal tiara that outweighed a palace in its worth. Sixtus IV made his nephew a millionaire, entered avidly into the game of politics, blessed the cannon that fought his battles, and financed his wars by selling church offices to the highest bidders. Innocent VIII celebrated in the Vatican the marriages of his children. Alexander VI, like Luther and Calvin, thought clerical celibacy a mistake and begot 5 or more children before subsiding into reasonable continence as a pope. His gay virility did not stick so sharply in the gullet of the time as we might suppose. A certain clandestine amorousness was then accepted as usual in the clergy. What offended Europe was that Alexander's unscrupulous diplomacy and the ruthless generalship of his son, Caesar Borgia, re-won the papal states for the papacy and added needed revenues and strength to the apostolic see. In these policies and campaigns, the Borgias used all those methods of stratagem and death which were soon to be formulated in Machiavelli's Prince of 1513 as indispensable to founding a powerful state or a united Italy. Pope Julius II out-Caesared Borgia in waging war against rapacious Venice and the invading French. He escaped whenever he could from the prison of the Vatican, led his army in person, and relished the rough life and speech of martial camps. Europe was shocked to see the papacy not only secularized, but militarized. Yet it could hardly withhold some admiration from a mighty warrior miscast as a pope. And some word went over the Alps about the services of Julius to art in his discriminating patronage of Raphael and Michelangelo. It was Julius who began the building of the new St. Peter's, and first granted indulgences to those who contributed to its cost. It was in his pontificate that Luther came to Rome and saw for himself that sink of iniquity which had been Lorenzo de' Medici's name for the capital of Christendom. No ruler in Europe could any longer think of the papacy as a moral super-government binding all the nations into a Christian commonwealth. The papacy itself, as a secular state, had become nationalistic. All Europe, as the old faith waned, fell into national fragments acknowledging no supranational or international moral law, and doomed to 5 centuries of inter-Christian wars. To judge these Renaissance popes fairly, we must see them against the background of their time. Northern Europe could feel their faults, since it financed them. But only those who knew the exuberant Italy of the period between Nicholas V, from 1447 to 1455, and Leo X, from 1513 to 1521, could view them with understanding lenience. Though several of them were personally pious, most of them accepted the Renaissance conviction that the world, while still for so many a vale of tears and devilish snares, could also be a scene of beauty, intense living, and fleeting happiness. It did not seem scandalous to them that they enjoyed life and the papacy. They had their virtues. They labored to redeem Rome from the ugliness and squalor into which it had fallen while the popes were at Avignon. They drained marshes, by comfortable proxy, paved streets, restored bridges and roads, improved the water supply, established the Vatican Library and the Capitoline Museum, enlarged the hospitals, distributed charity, built or repaired churches, embellished the city with palaces and gardens, reorganized the University of Rome, supported the humanists in resurrecting pagan literature, philosophy, and art, and gave employment to painters, sculptors, and architects whose works are now a treasured heritage of all mankind. They squandered millions. They used millions constructively. They spent too much on the new St. Peter's, but hardly more in proportion than the kings of France would spend on Fontainebleau and Versailles and the chateaux of the Loire. And perhaps they thought of it as transforming scattered crumbs of evanescent wealth into a lasting splendor for the people and their God. Most of these popes in private lived simply. Some, like Alexander VI, abstemiously, and resigned themselves to pomp and luxury only as required by public taste and discipline. They raised the papacy, which had so lately been scorned and destitute, to an impressive majesty of power. 4. The changing environment. But while the Church seemed to be growing again in grandeur and authority, Europe was undergoing economic, political, and intellectual changes that slowly undermined the structure of Latin Christianity. Religion normally thrives in an agricultural regime, science in an industrial economy. Every harvest is a miracle of the earth and a whim of the sky. The humble peasant, subject to weather and consumed with toil, sees supernatural forces everywhere, prays for a propitious heaven, and accepts a feudal religious system of graduated loyalties, mounting through vassal, liege lord, and king, to God. The city worker, the merchant, the manufacturer, the financier, live in a mathematical world of calculated quantities and processes, of material causes and regular effects. The machine and the counting table dispose them to see, over widening areas, the reign of natural law. The growth of industry, commerce, and finance in the 15th century, the passage of labor from the countryside to the town, the rise of the mercantile class, the expansion of local to national to international economy, all were of evil omen for a faith that had fitted in so well with feudalism and the somber vicissitudes of the fields. Businessmen repudiated ecclesiastical restraints as well as feudal tolls. The Church had to yield, by transparent theological jugglery, to the necessity of charging interest for loans if capital was to expand enterprise and industry. By 1500, the old prohibition of usury was universally ignored. Lawyers and businessmen more and more replaced churchmen and nobles in the administration of government. Law itself, triumphantly recapturing its Roman imperial traditions and prestige, led the march of secularization and day by day encroached on the sphere of ecclesiastical regulation of life by canon law. Secular courts extended their jurisdiction, episcopal courts declined. The adolescent monarchies, enriched by revenues from commerce and industry, freed themselves day by day from domination by the Church. The kings resented the residence in their realms of papal legates or nuncios, who acknowledged no authority but the popes, and made each nation's church a state within the state. In England, the statutes of provisors in 1351 and praemunire in 1353 sharply restricted the economic and judicial powers of the clergy. In France, the pragmatic sanction of bourges was theoretically abrogated in 1516, but the king retained the right to nominate archbishops, bishops, abbots, and priors. The Venetian Senate insisted on appointing to high ecclesiastical office in all Venetian dependencies. Ferdinand and Isabella overrode the popes in filling many ecclesiastical vacancies in Spain. In the Holy Roman Empire, where Gregory VII had maintained against Henry IV the papal right of investiture, Sixtus IV conceded to the emperors the right of nomination to 300 benefices and 7 bishoprics. The kings often misused these powers by giving church offices to political favorites, who took the revenues but ignored the responsibilities of their abbacies and sees. Many ecclesiastical abuses were traceable to such secular appointees. Meanwhile, the intellectual environment of the Church was changing, to her peril. She still produced laborious and conscientious scholars, but the schools and universities that she had founded had raised up an educated minority whose thinking did not always please the saints. Here St. Bernardino, toward 1420, Very many folk, considering the wicked life of monks and friars, nuns and secular clergy, are shaken by this. Nay, oftentimes they fail in faith, and believe in nothing higher than the roofs of their houses, not esteeming those things to be true that have been written concerning our faith, but believing them to have been written by the cozening invention of men, and not by God's inspiration. They despise the sacraments and hold that the soul has no existence. Neither do they fear hell nor desire heaven, but cling with all their hearts to transitory things, and resolve that this world shall be their paradise. Probably the business class was the least pious. As wealth mounts, religion declines. Gower, from about 1325 to 1408, claimed that the merchants of England cared little about the hereafter, saying, "He who can get the sweetness of this life and lets it go would be a fool. For no man knoweth whither or by what way we go after death." The failure of the Crusades had left a slowly fading wonder why the God of Christendom had permitted the victory of Islam, and the capture of Constantinople by the Turks refreshed these doubts. The work of Nicholas of Cusa in 1432 and Lorenzo Valla in 1439 in exposing the donation of Constantine as a forgery damaged the prestige of the Church and weakened her title to temporal power. The recovery and publication of classical texts nourished skepticism by revealing a world of learning and art that had flourished long before the birth of that Christian Church which, at the Fifth Council of the Lateran from 1512 to 1517, had denied the possibility of salvation outside her fold. Nulla salus extra ecclesiam. The discovery of America and the widening exploration of the East revealed 100 nations that with apparent impunity ignored or rejected Christ and had faiths of their own as positive and as morally efficacious as Christianity. Travelers returning from heathen lands brought some rubbing of strange creeds and rituals with them. These alien cults touched elbows with Christian worship and belief, and rival dogmas suffered attrition in the marketplace and the port. Philosophy, which in the 13th century had been the handmaid of theology, devoting itself to finding rational grounds for the orthodox faith, liberated itself in the 14th century with William of Ockham and Marsilius of Padua, and in the 16th became boldly secular, flagrantly skeptical with Pomponazzi, Machiavelli, and Guicciardini. Some 4 years before Luther's theses, Machiavelli wrote a startling prophecy. Had the religion of Christianity been preserved according to the ordinances of the founder, the state and commonwealth of Christendom would have been far more united and happy than they are. Nor can there be a greater proof of its decadence than the fact that the nearer people are to the Roman Church, the head of their religion, the less religious are they. And whoever examines the principles on which that religion is founded and sees how widely different from those principles its present practice and application are, will judge that her ruin or chastisement is near at hand. 5. The case against the Church. Shall we recapitulate the charges made by loyal Catholics against the Church of the 14th and 15th centuries? The first and sorest was that she loved money and had too much of it for her own good. In the Centum Gravimana, or 100 grievances, listed against the Church by the Diet of Nuremberg in 1522, it was alleged that she owned half the wealth of Germany. A Catholic historian reckoned the Church's share as a third in Germany and a fifth in France. But a Procureur General of the Parlement calculated in 1502 that 3/4 of all French wealth was ecclesiastical. No statistics are available to check these estimates. In Italy, of course, 1/3 of the peninsula belonged to the Church as the Papal States, and she owned rich properties in the rest. 6 factors served to accumulate lands in the possession of the Church. 1. Most of those who bequeathed property left something to her as fire insurance. And as the Church controlled the making and probating of wills, her agents were in a position to encourage such legacies. 2. Since ecclesiastical property was safer than other property from ravage by bandits, soldiers, or governments, some persons, for security, deeded their lands to the Church, held them as her vassals, and surrendered all right to them at death. Others willed part or all of their property to the Church on condition that she should provide for them in sickness or old age. In this way the Church offered disability insurance. 3. Crusaders had sold, or mortgaged and forfeited, lands to ecclesiastical bodies to raise cash for their venture. 4. Hundreds of thousands of acres had been earned for the church by the reclamation work of monastic orders. 5. Land once acquired by the church was inalienable, could not be sold or given away by any of her personnel, except through discouragingly complex means. 6. Church property was normally free from taxation by the state. Occasionally, however, kings reckless of damnation forced levies from the clergy, or found legal dodges to confiscate some portion of ecclesiastical wealth. The rulers of northern Europe might have grumbled less about the riches of the church if the income therefrom, or the multifarious contributions of the faithful, had remained within the national boundaries. They fretted at the sight of northern gold flowing in 1,000 streamlets to Rome. The church, however, looked upon herself as the chief agent in maintaining morality, social order, education, literature, scholarship, and art. The state relied upon her to fulfill these functions. To perform them, she needed an extensive and expensive organization. To finance this, she taxed and gathered fees. Even a church could not be governed by paternosters. Many bishops were the civil as well as the ecclesiastical rulers of their regions. Most of them were appointed by lay authorities, and came of patrician stock accustomed to easy morals and luxuries. They taxed and spent like princes. Sometimes, in the performance of their multiple functions, they scandalized the saints by donning armor and lustily leading their troops in war. Cardinals were chosen rarely for their piety, usually for their wealth or political connections or administrative capacity. They looked upon themselves not as monks burdened with vows, but as the senators and diplomats of a rich and powerful state. In many instances they were not priests, and they did not let their red hats impede their enjoyment of life. The church forgot the poverty of the apostles in the needs and expenses of power. Being worldly, the servants of the church were often as venal as the officials of contemporary governments. Corruption was in the mores of the time and in the nature of man. Secular courts were notoriously amenable to the persuasiveness of money, and no papal election could rival in bribery the election of Charles V as emperor. This accepted, the fattest bribes in Europe were paid at the Roman court. Reasonable fees had been fixed for the services of the curia, but the cupidity of the staff raised the actual cost to 20 times the legal sum. Dispensations could be had from almost any canonical impediment, almost any sin, provided the inducement was adequate. Aeneas Sylvius, before becoming pope, wrote that everything was for sale in Rome, and that nothing could be had there without money. A generation later, the monk Savonarola, with the exaggeration of indignation, called the Church of Rome a harlot, ready to sell her favors for coin. Another generation later, Erasmus remarked, "The shamelessness of the Roman curia has reached its climax." Pastor writes, "A deep-rooted corruption had taken possession of nearly all the officials of the curia. The inordinate number of gratuities and exactions passed all bounds. Moreover, on all sides deeds were dishonestly manipulated and even falsified by the officials. No wonder that there arose from all parts of Christendom the loudest complaints about the corruption and financial extortions of the papal officials." It was unusual for impecunious merit to mount in the Church of the 15th century. From the moderate fee charged for priestly ordination to the enormous sums that many cardinals paid for their elevation, nearly every appointment required the clandestine lubrication of superiors. A favorite papal device for raising funds was to sell ecclesiastical offices, or, as the popes saw the matter, to appoint to sinecures or honors, even to the cardinalate, persons who would make a substantial contribution to the expenses of the Church. Alexander VI created 80 new offices and received 760 ducats, or about $19,000, from each of the appointees. Julius II formed a college, or bureau, of 101 secretaries, who together paid him 74,000 ducats for the privilege. Leo X nominated 60 chamberlains and 141 squires to the papal household, and received from them 202,000 ducats. The salaries paid to such officials were looked upon, by giver and recipient, as endowment policy annuities, but to Luther they seemed the rankest simony. In thousands of cases the appointee lived far away from the benefice, the parish or abbacy or episcopacy, whose revenues supported his labor or luxury. and one man might be the absentee beneficiary of several such posts. So the active Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI to be, received from a variety of benefices an income of 70,000 ducats, or $1.75 million a year. And his furious foe, Cardinal della Rovere, later Julius II, held at one time the Archbishopric of Avignon, the bishoprics of Bologna, Lausanne, Coutances, Viviers, Mende, Ostia, and Velletri, and the abbacies of Nonantola and Grottaferrata. By this pluralism, the Church maintained her major executives, and in many instances, scholars, poets, and scientists. So Petrarch, sharp critic of the Avignon popes, lived on the sinecures that they granted him. Erasmus, who satirized 100 ecclesiastical follies, regularly received church pensions, and Copernicus, who did most damage to medieval Christianity, lived for years on church benefices involving a minimum of distraction from his scientific pursuits. A more serious charge than pluralism was laid against the personal morality of the clergy. "The morals of the clergy are corrupt," said the Bishop of Torcello in 1458. "They have become an offense to the laity." Of the 4 orders of friars founded in the 13th century, Franciscans, Dominicans, Carmelites, Augustinians, all but the last had become scandalously lax in piety and discipline. Monastic rules formulated in the fervor of early devotion proved too rigorous for a human nature increasingly freed from supernatural fears. Absolved by their collective wealth from the necessity of manual labor, thousands of monks and friars neglected religious services, wandered outside their walls, drank in taverns, and pursued amours. A 14th-century Dominican, John Bromyard, said of his fellow friars, "Those who should be the fathers of the poor covet delicate food and enjoy morning sleep. Very few vouchsafe their presence at matins or mass. They are consumed in gluttony and drunkenness, not to say in uncleanliness, so that now the assemblies of clerics are thought to be brothels of wanton folk and congregations of play-actors." Erasmus repeated the charge after a century. Many convents of men and women differ little from public brothels. Petrarch drew a favorable picture of discipline and devotion in the Carthusian monastery where his brother lived, and several convents in Holland and western Germany retained the spirit of study and piety that had formed the brethren of the common life and produced the imitation of Christ. Yet Johannes Trithemius, abbot of Sponheim, circa 1490, denounced the monks of this Rhenish Germany with violent hyperbole. "The 3 vows of religion are as little heeded by these men as if they had never promised to keep them. The whole day is spent in filthy talk. Their whole time is given to play and gluttony. In open possession of private property, each dwells in his own private lodging. They never fear nor love God. They have no thought of the life to come, preferring their fleshly lusts to the needs of the soul. They scorn the vow of poverty, know not that of chastity, revile that of obedience. The smoke of their filth ascends all around." Guy Juinot, a papal commissary sent to reform the Benedictine monasteries of France, turned in a gloomy report in 1503. "Many monks gamble, curse, haunt inns, carry swords, gather riches, fornicate, live the life of bacchanals, and are more worldly than the mere worldling. Were I minded to relate all those things that have come under my own eyes, I should make too long a tale of it." In the growing disorder of the monasteries, a great number of them neglected those admirable works of charity, hospitality, and education which had entitled them to public trust and support. Said Pope Leo X in 1516, "The lack of rule in the monasteries of France and the immodest life of the monks have come to such a pitch that neither kings, princes, nor the faithful at large have any respect left for them." A recent Catholic historian sums up the matter, as of 1490, with possibly excessive severity. Read the innumerable testimonies of this time, historical anecdotes, rebukes of moralists, satires of scholars and poets, papal bulls, synodal constituents. What do they say? Always the same facts and the same complaints. The suppression of conventual life, of discipline, of morals. Prodigious is the number of monastic robbers and debauchees. To realize their disorders, we must read the details revealed by judicial inquiry as to the internal state of the majority of the great abbeys. The abuses among the Carthusians were so great that the order was in ill repute almost everywhere. Monastic life had disappeared from the nunneries. All contributed to transform these asylums of prayer into centers of dissipation and disorder. The secular clergy, if we take a lenient attitude toward concubinage, present a better picture than the friars and monks. The chief sin of the simple parish priest was his ignorance, but he was too poorly paid and hard worked to have funds or time for study, and the piety of the people suggests that he was often respected and loved. Violations of the sacerdotal vow of chastity were frequent. In Norfolk, England, out of 73 accusations of incontinence filed in 1499, 15 were against clergymen. In Ripon, out of 126, 24. In Lambeth, out of 58, 9. That is, clerical offenders numbered some 23% of the total, though the clergy were probably less than 2% of the population. Some confessors solicited sexual favors from female penitents. Thousands of priests had concubines. In Germany, nearly all. In Rome, it was assumed that priests kept concubines. Some reports estimated the prostitutes there at 6,000, in a population not exceeding 100,000. To quote again a Catholic historian, "It is not surprising when the highest ranks of the clergy were in such a state that among the regular orders and secular priests vice and irregularities of all sorts should become more and more common. The salt of the earth had lost its savor. But it is a mistake to suppose that the corruption of the clergy was worse in Rome than elsewhere. There is documentary evidence of the immorality of the priests in almost every town on the Italian peninsula. No wonder, as contemporary writers sadly testify, the influence of the clergy had declined, and in many places hardly any respect was shown for the priesthood. Their immorality was so gross that suggestions in favor of allowing priests to marry began to be heard." In fairness to these lusty priests, we should consider that sacerdotal concubinage was not profligacy, but an almost universal rebellion against the rule of celibacy that had been imposed upon an unwilling clergy by Pope Gregory VII in 1074. Just as the Greek and Russian Orthodox Church, after the schism of 1054, had continued to permit marriage to its priests, so the clergy of the Roman Church demanded the same right. And since the canon law of their church refused this, they took concubines. Bishop Ardoin of Angers reported in 1428 that the clergy of his diocese did not count concubinage as sin, and that they made no attempt to disguise their use of it. In Pomerania, about 1500, such unions were recognized by the people as reasonable, and were encouraged by them as protection for their daughters and wives. At public festivals, the place of honor was given as a matter of course to priests and their consorts. In Schleswig, a bishop who tried to outlaw the practice was driven from his see in 1499. At the Council of Constance, Cardinal Zabarella proposed that if sacerdotal concubinage could not be suppressed, clerical marriage should be restored. And Emperor Sigismund, in a message to the Council of Basel in 1431, argued that the marriage of the clergy would improve public morals. Aeneas Sylvius was quoted by the contemporary historian Platina, librarian of the Vatican, as saying that there were good reasons for clerical celibacy, but better reasons against it. The moral record of the pre-Reformation priesthood stands in a better light if we view sacerdotal concubinage as a forgivable revolt against an arduous rule unknown to the apostles and to the Christianity of the East. The complaint that finally sparked the Reformation was the sale of indulgences. Through the powers apparently delegated by Christ to Peter, see Matthew chapter 16, verse 19, by Peter to bishops and by bishops to priests, the clergy were authorized to absolve a confessing penitent from the guilt of his sins and from their punishment in hell, but not from doing penance for them on earth. Now only a few men, however thoroughly shriven, could rely on dying with all due penances performed. The balance would have to be paid for by years of suffering in purgatory, which a merciful God had established as a temporary hell. On the other hand, many saints, by their devotion and martyrdom, had earned merits probably in excess of the penances due to their sins. Christ, by his death, had added an infinity of merits. These merits, said the theory of the Church, could be conceived as a treasury, on which the Pope might draw to cancel part or all of the temporal penalties incurred and unperformed by absolved penitents. Usually the penances prescribed by the Church had taken the form of repeating prayers, giving alms, making a pilgrimage to some sacred shrine, joining a crusade against Turks or other infidels, or donating money or labor to social projects like draining a swamp, building a road, bridge, hospital, or church. The substitution of a money fine, or Wehrgeld, for punishment was a long-established custom in secular courts. Hence, no furor was caused by the early application of the idea to indulgences. A shriven penitent, by paying such a fine, that is, making a money contribution to the expenses of the Church, would receive a partial or plenary indulgence, not to commit further sins, but to escape a day, a month, a year in purgatory, or all the time he might have had to suffer there to complete his penance for his sins. An indulgence did not cancel the guilt of sins. This, when the priest absolved a contrite penitent, was forgiven in the confessional. An indulgence, therefore, was the remission, by the Church, of part or all of the temporal, that is, not eternal, penalties incurred by sins whose guilt had been forgiven in the sacrament of penance. This ingenious and complicated theory was soon transformed by the simplicity of the people, and by the greed of the quaestiarii, or pardoners, commissioned or presuming to distribute the indulgences. As these purveyors were allowed to retain a percentage of the receipts, some of them omitted to insist on repentance, confession, and prayer, and left the recipient free to interpret the indulgence as dispensing him from repentance, confession, and absolution, and as depending almost entirely upon the money contribution. About 1450, Thomas Gascoigne, Chancellor of Oxford University, complained that sinners say nowadays, "I care not how many evils I do in God's sight, for I can easily get plenary remission of all guilt and penalty by an absolution and indulgence granted me by the Pope, whose written grant I have bought for 4 or 6 pence, or have won as a stake for a game of tennis with the pardoner." For these indulgence-mongers wander over the country and give a letter of pardon, sometimes for 2pence, sometimes for a draught of wine or beer, or even for the hire of a harlot, or for carnal love. The popes, Boniface IX in 1392, Martin V in 1420, Sixtus IV in 1478, repeatedly condemned these misconceptions and abuses, but they were too pressed for revenue to practice effective control. They issued bulls so frequently and for so confusing a variety of causes that men of education lost faith in the theory and accused the Church of shamelessly exploiting human credulity and hope. In some cases, as in the indulgences offered by Julius II in 1510 or by Leo X in 1513, the official wording lent itself to the purely monetary interpretation. A Franciscan friar of high rank described with anger how chests were placed in all the churches of Germany to receive payments by those who, having been unable to go to Rome for the Jubilee of 1450, could now obtain the same plenary indulgence by money dropped in the box. And he warned the Germans a half-century before Luther that by indulgences and other means their savings were being drained off to Rome. Even the clergy complained that indulgences were snaring into papal coffers contributions that might otherwise have been secured for local ecclesiastical uses. Again, a Catholic historian sums up the matter with admirable candor. Nearly all abuses connected with indulgences rose from this, that the faithful, after frequenting the sacrament of penance as the recognized condition for gaining the indulgence, found themselves called on to make an offering of money in proportion to their means. This offering for good works, which should have been only accessory, was in certain cases made into the chief condition. The need of money, instead of the good of souls, became only too often the end of the indulgence. Though in the wording of the bulls the doctrine of the Church was never departed from, and confession, contrition, and definitely prescribed good works were made the condition for gaining the indulgence, still the financial side of the matter was always apparent, and the necessity for making offerings of money was placed most scandalously in the foreground. Indulgences took more and more the form of a monetary arrangement, which led to many conflicts with the secular powers, who were always demanding a share of the proceeds. Almost as mercenary as the sale of indulgences was the acceptance or solicitation by the clergy of money payments, grants, legacies, for the saying of masses supposed to reduce a dead soul's term of punishment in purgatory. Large sums were devoted to this purpose by pious people, either to relieve a departed relative or friend, or to shorten or annul their own purgatorial probation after death. The poor complained that, through their inability to pay for masses and indulgences, it was the earthly rich, not the meek, who would inherit the kingdom of heaven. And Columbus ruefully praised money because he said, "He who possesses it has the power of transporting souls into paradise." 1,000 other grievances swelled the case against the Church. Many of the laity resented the exemption of the clergy from the laws of the state and the dangerous lenience of ecclesiastical courts to ecclesiastical offenders. The Nuremberg Diet of 1522 declared that no justice could be had by a lay plaintiff against a clerical defendant before a spiritual tribunal, and warned that unless the clergy were subjected to secular courts, there would be an uprising against the Church in Germany. The uprising, of course, had then already begun. Further complaints alleged the divorce of religion from morality, the emphasis laid on orthodox belief rather than on good conduct, though the reformers were to be in this particular greater sinners than the Church, the absorption of religion in ritual, the useless idleness and presumed sterility of monks, the exploitation of popular credulity through bogus relics and miracles, the abuse of excommunication and interdict, the censorship of publications by the clergy, the espionage and cruelty of the Inquisition, the misuse, for other purposes, of funds contributed for crusades against the Turks, and the claim of a deteriorated clergy to be the sole administrators of every sacrament except baptism. All the foregoing factors entered into the anti-clericalism of Roman Catholic Europe at the beginning of the 16th century. The contempt and hatred of the laity for the degenerate clergy, says Pastor, was no mean factor in the great apostasy. A London bishop complained in 1515 that the people be so maliciously set in favor of heretical pravity that they will condemn any cleric, though he were as innocent as Abel. Among laymen, Erasmus reported, the title of clerk or priest or monk was a term of bitter insult. In Vienna, the priesthood, once the most desired of all careers, received no recruits in the 20 years preceding the Reformation. Throughout Latin Christendom, men cried out for a reform of the Church in head and members. Passionate Italians like Arnold of Brescia, Joachim of Flora, and Savonarola of Florence had attacked ecclesiastical abuses without ceasing to be Catholics, but 2 of them had been burned at the stake. Nevertheless, good Christians continued to hope that reform might be accomplished by the Church's loyal sons. Humanists like Erasmus, Collet, More, and Boudet dreaded the disorder of an open break. It was bad enough that the Greek Church remained resolutely apart from the Roman. Any further rending of the seamless robe of Christ threatened the survival of Christianity itself. The Church tried repeatedly, and often sincerely, to cleanse her ranks and her courts, and to adopt a financial ethic superior to the lay morality of the times. The monasteries tried again and again to restore their austere rules, but the constitution of man rewrote all constitutions. The councils tried to reform the Church and were defeated by the popes. The popes tried and were defeated by the cardinals and the bureaucracy of the Curia. Leo X himself, in 1516, mourned the utter inefficacy of these endeavors. Enlightened churchmen like Nicholas of Cusa achieved local reforms, but these were transient. Denunciations of the Church's shortcomings by her enemies and her lovers excited the schools, disturbed the pulpits, flooded the literature, mounted day by day, year by year, in the memory and resentment of men, until the dam of reverence and tradition burst, and Europe was swept by a religious revolution more far-reaching and profound than all the political transformations of modern times. Chapter 2. England, Wycliffe, Chaucer, and the Great Revolt, 1308 to 1400. 1. The Government. On February 25, 1308, Edward II, 6th King of the House of Plantagenet, in a solemn coronation before the hierarchy and nobility assembled in Westminster Abbey, took the oath that England proudly requires of all her sovereigns. Archbishop of Canterbury, Sire, will you grant and keep, and by your oath confirm, to the people of England the laws and customs to them granted by the ancient kings of England, your righteous and godly predecessors, and especially the laws, customs, and privileges granted to the clergy and people by the glorious King St. Edward, your predecessor? King, I grant them and promise. Archbishop, Sire, will you keep toward God and Holy Church, and to clergy and people, peace and accord in God entirely after your power? King, I will keep them. Archbishop, Sire, will you cause to be done in all your judgments equal and right justice and discretion, in mercy and truth to your power? King, I will do so. Archbishop, Sire, do you grant to hold and to keep the laws and righteous customs which the community of your realm shall have chosen, and will you defend and strengthen them to the honor of God, to the utmost of your power? King, I grant and promise. Having so sworn, and being duly anointed and consecrated with holy oils, Edward II consigned the government to corrupt and incompetent hands, and devoted himself to a life of frivolity with Piers Gaveston, his Ganymede. The barons rebelled, caught and slew Gaveston in 1312, and subordinated Edward and England to their feudal oligarchy. Returning in disgrace from his defeat by the Scots at Bannockburn in 1314, Edward solaced himself with a new love, Hugh le Despencer III. The conspiracy of his neglected wife, Isabella of France, and her paramour, Roger de Mortimer, deposed him in 1326. He was murdered in Berkeley Castle by Mortimer's agent in 1327, and his 15-year-old son was crowned as Edward III. The noblest event of this age in English history was the establishment in 1322 of a precedent that required the consent of a National Assembly for the validity of any law. It had long been the custom of English monarchs, in their need, to summon a king's council of prominent nobles and prelates. In 1295, Edward I, warring at once with France, Scotland, and Wales, and most earnestly desirous of cash and men, instructed every city, borough, and leading town to send 2 burgesses, or enfranchised citizens, and every shire or county to send 2 knights, or minor nobles, to a national assembly that would form, with the king's council, the first English Parliament. The towns had money, which their delegates might be persuaded to vote to the king. The shires had yeomen, or freeholders, who would make sturdy archers and pikemen. The time had come to build these forces into the structure of British government. There was no pretense at full democracy. Though the towns were, or by 1400 would be, free from feudal overlordship, the urban vote was confined to a small minority of propertied men. The nobles and clergy remained the rulers of England. They owned most of the land, employed most of the population as their tenants or serfs, and organized and directed the armed forces of the nation. The Parliament, as it came to be called under Edward III, met in the royal palace at Westminster, across from the historic abbey. The archbishops of Canterbury and York, the 18 bishops, and the major abbots sat at the right of the king. 100 dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, and barons sat on his left. The Prince of Wales and the king's council gathered near the throne, and the judges of the realm, seated on woolsacks to remind them how vital the wool trade was to England, attended to advise on points of law. At the opening of the session, the burgesses and knights, later known as the Commons, stood uncovered below a bar that separated them from the prelates and lords. Now, for the first time in 1295, the National Assembly had an upper and a lower house. The united houses received from the king or his chancellor a pronunciatio, the later speech from the throne, explaining the subjects to be discussed and the appropriations desired. Then the Commons withdrew to meet in another hall, usually the chapter house of Westminster Abbey. There they debated the royal proposals. These deliberations ended, they delegated a speaker to report the result to the upper house and to present their petitions to the king. At the close of the sessions, the 2 houses came together again to receive the reply of the sovereign and to be dismissed by him. Only the king had the authority to summon or dissolve the Parliament. This book is continued on Cassette 2, Side 1.